Okay, so today we are talking about the history of Jewish American organizing. I put some links on the website. Um, we're not going to probably go over them as much as well, certainly not all of them, but just to tell you a few things about what's on there. So if you want to look later, hold on, can I make this smaller so I can look at you and at them? All right. So the first thing, timeline of Jews in America, is not just about power. It's about like the entire settlement of Jewish people in the Americas. So it's very expansive, but it does include some major milestones of like Jews in politics and things like that. Um, the intro to the book Jewish Power by J.J. Goldberg, I found for some reason the whole introductory chapter was like included um in a separate link, but part of the Washington Post's review of the book. So the book is from 1996, so it's like in their archives. I stumbled across it, and I thought the introduction was pretty interesting. I didn't necessarily agree with everything said, but it was like a pretty basic, like good analysis of like Jews in politics in America. Um, the review, which I didn't link on the website, but if you go to the intro to the book, you can click the next link to go to the review from the Washington Post. The reviewer did not like this book, which I thought was interesting. So you can make your own decision if you want to read more of it. I also couldn't find anything concise from Jonathan Sarna, but he is like the leading Jewish American sociologist. So I'm sure if you're really interested in this topic, any of his writings, his books, I mean, probably not his Haggadah won't have a lot on Jewish power because it will be about Passover, but his essays and his you know, books are a lot on this topic. Um then there's an article that's just like a list, a slideshow of contemporary Jewish politicians, just kind of interesting. And then the source sheets. So that's where I really wanted to focus on today, but just to like summarize a little bit the other sources on the website that you can look at more, or other places you can look for more information on the topic. I think the general analysis seems to be that, excuse me, Jews in America have been uniquely positioned to exercise political power because we come from this long line of not having political power. And so we know how to like organize against the odds. We know how to speak truth to power. I mean, that's a Quaker saying, but like I think it very much applies to Jewish communities. But then in America, we didn't face the same level of institutionalized anti-Semitism that we did in other countries, which is, of course, not to say that we didn't face anti-Semitism or that whatever, that there weren't institutions that kept us out of political arenas as well. But it never reached the same depth, I guess I want to say, as in other countries that schools had these quotas, but we were never not citizens in America the way we were in Russia, for example. So it was like, it's kind of, I just thought of this analogy just right now. So it's not fully fleshed out, but I'm thinking like, so Sabra cactuses, right? That's what Israelis call themselves, as Sabras. Sabra cactuses are actually an invasive species from further in the, not Sinai, what's the other, Arabian, in the Arabian Peninsula. So they're used to much harsher deserts. And then sometime like 300 years ago, they made their way into Israel from like traders and things like that. And they just flourished because it's still a desert, like it's still the right kind of ecosystem for them, but it's so much more temperate than the Arabian desert. And so they just like thrived. And like that's kind of how Jews in America are, right? Like we're used to this like much harsher conditions that we have to fight against. And now we're like ready, but we don't have quite as much resistance. So we're like able to just push forward for democracy and progressive values in America. Um, so yeah, there's that. One of the source sheets that I put on there, I wanted to look at because, yeah, okay. I liked this top comparison here. I think this gets to a good heart of the matter as well, not as much of it as a power analysis, but just in terms of like why Jews care about these issues. So, who would like to read the Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote here?
I can.
Great.
The demand for justice runs through the entirety of Jewish tradition. This was
What is
Ruth.
she referring to? What is Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg mean when she says that? Terry says, I don't know.
Various quotes from Torah and from Talmud. Justice shall you pursue, and don't put the stumbling block. That's my favorite one, and all that kind of good stuff.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of demand for justice, really explicit in Judaism. There's a lot of room for analysis and debate on what counts as justice. That's where we get, stuck sometimes. But yeah, it's pretty core to Jewish values. Now, how about Hannah Arendt? Who can read this one? Michelle, you're still off mute, so why don't you just go for it?
The only political ideals are, the only political ideals that impressed people can have are freedom and justice. Democracy can be their only form of organization.
So what is Hannah Arendt saying here? About Jews and justice?
Well, it can only go up. Yeah, if you're oppressed, then the first political ideals you have to have are freedom to no longer be oppressed, and justice would be a part of that.
Yes. Does anyone have any other analysis of the what did they used to say in English class? Compare and contrast these quotes. Okay, because I actually don't think they're that different. So the creator of this source sheet says, Ginsburg and Arendt give different reasons for Jewish affinity for democracy. What are they? And I do agree that they are sort of different reasons. But the core narrative in our most ancient text is freedom from slavery, right? It's the Exodus. So it's already coming from that idea of being an oppressed people, reaching for freedom and needing to fight for justice. That then creates this demand for justice throughout the entirety of Jewish tradition. Like, I think Arendt is probably speaking more to what was contemporary for her time, the oppression of Jews in Europe, but like it actually that is also a part of the entirety of Jewish tradition.
Is the reason,
Yeah. Sorry,
is
go
the
ahead,
reason
Debbie.
that she finishes the quote with democracy is their only form of organization? It sounds like she's arguing a case for democracy. Was this for during the formation of Israel? What kind of government they should have, or I don't know.
No, it's too early for that.
Well, they were thinking about it then. I mean, they must have been planning and plotting, but
I think they've been thinking and planning it for a long time, but this was written during World War II, so
Yeah.
I'm sure she was talking about the situation in Europe.
Right. I
And
think she was
possibly
talking
the
about the
situation
situation
here.
in Europe and I mean, she was writing, she wrote from America. I think she's from Germany originally. I didn't look up her biography. I probably should have done that. But she was writing from a place of safety to be criticizing the Nazi regime, even though she is also Jewish. Yes, German American. So, but I think she was writing from the position of as an American, this fight for democratization against fascism in Europe. But as you know, as a Jewish person as well, coming from that perspective. Okay. Abraham Joshua Heschel. We don't need to read all of the rest of this source sheet, like I said, but if you're familiar with Abraham Joshua Heschel, his probably most famous quote is that when he marched, was it on Washington or on Selma? On Washington, I think, with Martin Luther King Jr., his feet were praying. So he has this quote as well about prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive. He also had a whole speech about Pharaoh, like the modern day pharaohs, basically drawing again a direct comparison. He certainly wasn't the first or the last, but he said it very beautifully and very Jewishly. The direct comparison between the Jewish exodus and the fight for civil rights for Black Americans. So and he was an Orthodox Jew, German born, but had this very strong sense of social justice and American democracy. So I guess there's a lot of material here that we can get into, but I think what I wanted to talk about more is like, I guess, conceptual and analyzing what some of these texts are saying. So I think there's this thread of like part of it is the Jewish fight for justice as a social justice value, like progressive values, but then also the concept of democracy, of I mean, I guess that's still a progressive value, but it feels so basic as Americans, right? But the role that American Jews have been able to play in American democracy. I think that is the piece that I wanted to be able to focus on. And so I guess I was wondering, just to start out with, if there are questions or thoughts on that history that you all had as sort of a jumping off point. We lost Lamar.
Riley, are you looking at it from the role of, well, we had businesses, money, and so that gave power and influence, or from the perspective of, using your feet to, walk, protest, or your mouth to open up to, speak up when you see something wrong, or all of it.
Yeah, I think all of it, right? So like, I mean, part of it's from the very beginning. Um, well, actually, what is the beginning? That's a good question. So I was gonna say the very beginning, we have Washington's letter to the Jews, right? That American Jews had really unprecedented religious freedom in this country. I guess it did exist in some places in some times. So to say unprecedented maybe is an extreme, but that it never existed as consistently as it did in this country, in any other country we lived in. So that's what I was thinking of as the beginning, right? That gave us a position to feel empowered to pray with our feet, to march, to speak truth to power and all that. But you're right that like also there is that, the first Jewish settlers in America were Sephardi like tradesmen. Like they came with money. And I wonder if that positioned those early communities, in a place that like made the colonial powers more inclined to recognize that that religious freedom. I hadn't thought about that, but I think that that's probably true. And then certainly in the post-war era, um, you've probably heard me mention this book before, How the Jews Became White Folks and what that says about race in America today. It's a little outdated now. The author, Karen something, she's got a like, it's not, doesn't sound like a Jewish last name. It's like Smith or Brooks or something. But anyway, I mean, anybody can, whatever. Anyway, but she has written more recent essays about how her racial analysis, it needed some updating, but it was written in the 90s, so like whatever. But it's good in terms of how it very clearly lays out things like the Veterans Bill after World War II, that allowed for white ethnics, Jews, Polish, Italians, Irish, to access more benefits like of whiteness that they had been previously banned from. Educational access. It's sort of the beginning of like redlining and things like that too. The moving out to the suburbs, the opening up of country clubs. I mean, that wasn't part of the Veterans Bill, but it was like part of the direct fallout of that, and all of those things that that didn't apply to people of color. So that definitely was a positioning of power that was still very new for the civil rights movement. Like for the rabbis that marched with King, that was still very transgressive and dangerous for them. But they certainly had access to slightly more power at that point than they had maybe 20 years earlier, and our communities have kind of only gone up from there. And there's obviously still poor Jews and poor Jewish communities and all of that, but like as a whole, Jewish communities have flourished in America since the end of World War II. That again, I think allows more access to power to protest and to make their voices heard, to create lobby groups like APAC and things like that. Or the RAC, we're going to talk more about that next time, but like the reform movement has its own lobby group that, goes to Congress to argue on behalf of what we see are Jewish values in American politics. I mean, like that's unprecedented. Like, so, and we're the only movement that has that. There are other obviously other Jewish groups that from non-Reformed Jews that go to their senators and congressmen to talk about Jewish values, but we're the only ones that have like a specified lobby group that, in lobbies, yeah, you do office visits, but it also is about leveraging money and like collective power and voice, things like that. So, that's a thing we just never had before in other countries that we lived in. And I think, again, like it's that very unique position of having not had it and now having it that makes us more inclined to use it than some other communities. So that's why you see, I, I don't want to say disproportionate because that makes it feel like, that feeds into the anti-Semitic tropes of like we're taking over. But like more than 2% of Congress has been Jewish. You know what I mean? But like we're only 2% of the population. So it's still not a majority or anything, but it's more than 2%. Um, and I guess it also depends on how you count it, who's Jewish. But um anyway, yeah, so I think all of those things play into it. Yes, Debbie.
So historically, I mean, the theory that the GI Bill opened up
Yeah.
the American world to us, is that, I mean, is that, I sort of always wondered what the transition was between no Jews or dogs or Negroes allowed. Let the Jews become white, as you say. And that, I mean, I just assumed it was money, enough, maybe Jewish manufacturers made enough money during the war to open their own country clubs, and then it's easy for people with money wanting to get together with other people for money to make more money, and I thought it sort of had something to do with that. But
Yeah.
that's interesting that the GI Bill.
Well, I think money does still have to do with it, but money like class and race, I mean, I use that very loosely as it applies to Jews, but like they're very intertwined, So whereas Jews had historically lived in the cities, and had limited access to secular education. It was still better in this country than in a lot of other places in the world historically, but there were the quotas. But once all that was dropped, again, like then once Jews are in the suburbs and have Harvard degrees and things like that, it makes it easier for like to connect with other people with money, like housing segregation and everything, right? Like that's one of the taglines for Code Switch, NPR's Race in America podcast, that like the being able to live in the suburbs was huge for Jewish communities. But of course there was Jewish organizing before that too, right? Like I've said before, the labor movement in this country comes a lot out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and that sort of thing. It was largely Jewish and Irish women that won the hard fights for weekends and building codes and all of the things we take for granted. And that was pre-World War II. That was urban. So there's something in our values, right? Like Ruth Bader Ginsburg says, that pushes us toward this fight. But I also think, when we're analyzing the power dynamics of Jewish communities specifically in America, it just feels like it's very unique, that it has to do with the unprecedented welcome we got. I mean, welcome feels like a weird word too. I'm not sure what the right but the access, I guess, the lack of fear of pogroms, you know? I mean, that is a huge thing that and I mean, I say Russia as my default because like that's where, I mean, my family is from Lithuania, but it was the Russian oligarchs or whatever that were, or the czarist forces that they were fighting against. But like, if you spoke out against them, you got killed or sent to the Siberia or whatever. And in America, we just didn't have that level of existential fear that made it easier to access those traditions of fighting for justice.
We just watched Oppenheimer last night, and it reminded me of the all the Jews that joined the communist movement, not the Russian communist movement,
Right.
but using it as a platform for justice,
Right.
as you said, and it didn't get down to pogroms, but it was hard for them to move out of them. My uncle was somebody that did that, and he ended up being blacklisted for in his particular industry, and took him years to get job, and so we still had that battle to fight. And whether that, I don't know if that was anti-Semitic or not, but a lot of Jews were in the communist movement, and I suspect
Right.
that there was some connection there.
Yes, I agree. There is definitely a connection there. And the rhetoric against Jews and against communists at that time had a lot of crossover, that they like were sort of two different, you know, one was ideological and one was bigotry, but like there was a lot of overlap there for sure. And partly because there were a lot of Jews in the American Communist Party. But also then it's like, you know, it's part of, this is a little off topic of power in American politics, but it's relevant in that like one of the things that Jews have had to look out for in how they wield power in American politics, that's how I'll bring it back to topic though, is that kind of no matter which side you fight for or how you fight, um, it gets labeled with an anti-Semitic trope, right? Like you have someone like Soros, who's this millionaire philanthropist, and he's like the worst of capitalism, and you know, sowing his racial discord and whatever they think he's doing. And then you have, I guess I can't think of, oh, Bernie Sanders, I guess, is the closest contemporary example of for a communist, right? That like, you know, and that's the other thing is like Jews are all communists and they want to take away all your belongings and whatever. And it's like we can't all be communists and all be capitalists at the same time. Like you got to pick one, guys. Yeah, go ahead, Dad.
One of the stories that I heard was that people like my grandparents who were from Vilna became Red Russians or communists
Right.
because they were opposed to the White Russians that were killing them. So when they came here, they were socialists. And I know that they joined a cell, but was from what I was told, whether it was political, and it may have been, but they liked to sing. So they joined
Yeah.
various cells that were choruses, there were choirs or choruses. Whatever was political going on, there may have been, but that was the claim why they joined anyway.
Right. Which I mean, both could be true. Like I grandma used to be very defensive of her father. Like my father's not a communist. Like, okay, grandma, he was a proletariat Jew who stood on street corners yelling down with the czar and wanted equality for all people. What would you call that? I don't know. But you know, it had such a dirty word, a dirty connotation in this country, like communist. So that's socialist. But there were a lot of social Jewish clubs with socialist leanings, like the American Jewish, like the Bundists, not to be confused with the Nazi Bundists, but uh, the Workmen's Circle, Which I didn't realize how widespread that was. I just learned at the ISJL conference that there were a workmen's circle, which was like a socialist Jewish organization throughout the South. That was like the biggest Jewish communities, the biggest source for Jewish communities in like Mississippi, in the 1800s or something, or the early 1900s. And I think of it as so New York and Boston, right? Like, but again, there's that, I guess, we were able to leave the cities. Like Jews are everywhere. Yes, Terry, you had a hand.
What's the difference between a socialist and somebody that wants social justice?
Well, socialism is also has to do with like economic.
Right, right.
So theoretically, you can be a capitalist social justice advocate. Like,
Okay.
or so like the democratic socialists, I guess, kind of toe that
Okay.
line, like Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, that like
Right.
believe in private capital, but also believe in free healthcare first, like that kind of stuff. Like there's a
So they would be
spectrum.
centrists. I understand now. Yeah,
I think a lot of people would disagree with that label for them. But yes,
but
sure.
at the continuum
Yeah. Left of center, but not all the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yes, you're welcome. So I think but there's certainly some overlap, and especially in Jewish communities. And I guess in America we tend to focus on I wish I knew more of the history of other Jewish like social movements, I guess. But in America we are very Ashkenormative. And so there is this like very direct link between like Yiddish culture and that, anti-czarist sort of socialist labor movement, connection that certainly feels like it comes from very deep in Jewish text as well, but I'd be curious to see how it varies from other Jewish communities. Debbie, you look like you have something else to say. You're muted though.
I hadn't thought about that, and I guess the Sephardim in this country, I mean, they were kicked out of their countries, so hundreds of years ago, and made their way here, some directly, but a lot of them through northern countries before they came here, and they didn't have that the czar to fight against. So I don't know who they. I mean, they. I don't know. Did they keep their heads down and survive that way, and finally make it here? And I mean, they weren't isolationists or anything like that, but I mean, there were Sephardic communities in Brooklyn near us, and but I also don't know what their histories were. I mean, that you think about them more in the jewelry business and in the like owning garment businesses, not the workers so much.
Right.
But I don't know if that's true or if that's just a generalization on my part.
Yeah. I mean, they did the oldest Jewish communities in America were Sephardic. So there is a sense of like more establishment, more and a lot of them were merchants. They came with their money as opposed to Eastern European peasants that couldn't take their chickens with them. So like, they had nothing when they showed up. So but I mean, there are lots of different Sephardi communities. I can't imagine they were all wealthy Dutch traders, descendants of Inquisition Jews. So I'm not sure how that fits in with the wider narrative. But I certainly feel like I associate very much the Jewish left with Yiddish culture. And you see that in like in social movements. I mean, the labor movement, there's that famous picture of the two young girls during like after I don't know, in like the Rose Schneiderman era of labor movement, and they have the sashes that say like free workers or like workers for freedom or something in Yiddish, right? So um
And
there's
then there was the Forward, which was a Yiddish newspaper.
Yes.
Was there equivalent Sephardic publications at the time? I was just looking that up. I don't know.
I don't know either. There must have been, I would think. But again, the Sephardim had been here longer, so there might have been English Jewish newspapers that they read, as opposed to, I mean, Ladino is a much more endangered language than
Right.
Yiddish is. So I don't know how many American Jews at the turn of the 20th century would have really spoken Ladino anymore.
That's true. They wouldn't have needed it. But there must have been some community papers, but we
Right. I'm
Yeah.
sure that is true. Anshe Chesed, I think, is one of the old shuls in New York. That's a Sephardi synagogue, and it's like one of the oldest continuous Jewish communities in America. I
this
can't imagine they didn't have some kind of newsletter.
says founded in 1922. There was the Sephardic Voice from New York, the Ladino newspaper Lavara. It was founded in 22. And then
Does
there
it
was,
say if it had a political bent the way the Farvarts did?
I haven't read that deep. And then there was another one called yeah, I don't know. I'd have to read more about it. Struggles, immigration struggles. I don't know. You will take the stick in your hand and you will whack them and not let any hypocrite remain in health. I don't know if that's justice or not. That's the quote in here.
Somebody's idea of justice, it sounds like.
It's a humorous paper, it says.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And then
So then it's probably progressive because conservatives aren't funny.
right. I love that. And there was another one, La America, Political and Commercial Weekly.
Okay.
It was Sephardic businessmen. So yes, so there were. We just don't hear about them.
Well, the Farvarts became the Forward. So like I think that's part of why we remember them, because they're still around. I mean, they are not in Yiddish, and they're not so progressive anymore, but I guess it depends on where on the spectrum you're looking from, but they're still there and they still hold that lineage, I guess. Whereas what are the descendants of those other papers, right? Like we don't know. Does anybody have any other, but I want to, if we have time, take a quick look at the last source sheet, just a little scan, but if anyone has other thoughts or questions about how Jews or why Jews have exercised political power in America.
Just, we don't, I mean, these days we have more people in Congress, more people in the Supreme Court than before. But as a general population, it seems like we don't use our power the way we did in the 50s and the 60s when civil rights were, I mean, you try your best with us. And, but we don't show up as much as we used to. Is there a reason for that? Or have we just gotten too comfortable or?
Yes. That's, I mean, that's the price of whiteness, right?
Complacency.
What?
Complacency.
Yeah, complacency.
I mean, I wouldn't go as far as sea change, and I really did not like the last meeting that we had. I don't think we're white supremacists. We're not happy with what we see, but we don't work as hard against what we see as we used to.
I must have missed the last meeting because
did miss
I,
that one. That I was anyway, but that's besides
Okay.
the point for today. We don't like what we see. We still don't like it. We still believe that it's wrong, but we
Yes.
don't fight as hard as we used to.
yes, I think that is true. I think that that is because we have lost some of that the urgency that was felt when our own oppression was closer. And I think there was a,
Comfortable.
oh, sorry, go
sorry.
ahead, Terry. No, what were you
I
gonna
just,
say?
we're comfortable.
Yes.
That's all.
I think in 2016, 2017, when there was a huge jump in anti-Semitism, there was a lot more Jewish political involvement. Like I saw from my, my activist friends and stuff, I saw a huge jump of like older Jews getting back involved with organizing. But then, it still didn't reach us institutionally the same way. Like anti-Semitic hate crimes have continued to be at an all-time high for the last 4 years, 6 years, higher than they had been for the 40 years previous. So like that sucks, but public universities did not reinstitute quotas. Jobs are not firing Jews because they're Jews. At least not, they're not saying that if they are. I mean, I'm sure somebody has a case out there, but like we never got to that level politically. And so the urgency fell away, right? Like we're not really under that kind of existential threat that we used to feel and that some communities still feel. And so it's easier to look the other way or to say, oh, that's so sad, and not. And I think also the geography is different. I mean, a lot of civil rights stuff happened in the cities. I mean, there was also like the get out the votes and or that's probably not what they called it, but the registering to vote and like helping people with the literacy tests and all of that kind of stuff that had to go to small towns. But a lot of the like action, a lot of the protests, all of that happened in big cities where Jews lived. For us out, like we don't live that close to DC. Like we live pretty close, but not close enough that like our community wants to go to a protest in DC if that's what's happening. Or even necessarily go for a lobby day to our senators or Congress people, representatives. We get invited every once in a while through Voice or the JCRC and organizations like that to go on to go with a bigger group to Richmond and talk to our local, our state senate and things like that. And I've stopped passing those invitations on because I never got anybody interested. So, if we lived in the cities, maybe we would be more interested because it would be convenient. But we don't live there anymore. And young Jews are moving back to the city. I mean, this is sort of separate from the political question, but just in terms of like Jewish sociology and geography and all of that, Gen Z and millennials are concentrated more in the cities or the immediate suburbs, whereas boomers and Gen X had moved out of there. Like a lot of the boomers were born in the cities and then moved out, and then Gen X and millennials were all born in the suburbs. But millennials with children are raising their children back in the cities at much higher rates. And Jews, at least specifically, I don't know how that extends out to other Americans, but Jewish communities in the suburbs are dying because they're moving back to the cities. So I don't know, how will that change the layout of Jewish political power if we're more geographically close to the seats of power? Okay. So the last thing, Juliet, you're making a face. What? You have to unmute yourself first before you say it, though. Okay, there you go.
I understand the geography part, but I don't think we're in enough pain. If we were in pain, we would
Yes.
make the trek.
Yes, I think that's also a big part of it. Like I said, I think the institutional discrimination, that's the word I was looking for, just isn't there for us anymore. And when it seemed like it could get there, there was a big jump for like 6 months in Jewish political organizing. And then when it was clear that Trump's just a loudmouth and he wasn't gonna actually like take away our rights, people stopped caring. Jewish rights. I saw like a look there. I know there were other things. Okay. Oh, Simcha and Percy have to get ready to go to the screening in Manassas. I know Debbie and David also wanted to do that. So just one last thing, and if you have to go, go. But one last thing for those of us who are staying on till 2, was this last source sheet I shared on the website. It's the one that's labeled like a sort of confusingly structured source sheet. So maybe it wouldn't be confusing to all of you. I thought, what just happened? Okay, a bunch of tabs just flew out at me. I don't know if that happened on the share screen. But this source sheet, sorry. Some of the Hebrew texts are the same as on the other one. Stuff about why we care about democracy, why God didn't want us to have a king, but we got one anyway. All of that stuff, the warnings about power, about concentrated power, I should say, that definitely all influence the Jewish cultural, ethical lens of political power. But then it also got into some of this other ancient law, which was interesting, but I had trouble sort of like, I don't know what the Codex Theodosianus is. Like some of this or this like legalese just got a little lost on me. And the where it swaps from quoting the Codex to then the creator of this source sheet, there's no marker. So that I found that sort a little hard to follow, but still there is some there's some good meat in there to look over and glean about Jewish relationships to power. So I wanted to share that and just make that disclaimer and encourage you to look more on that. The Napoleonic Sanhedrin is a great example of Jewish relationship to power, and what had to be given up to get it. That again, just like didn't exist in this country. We were so lucky in America, and it's never been perfect. And as those of us who are leaving soon to go watch this documentary about a synagogue shooting, we know there's more fight to fight. But as American Jews, we have been so uniquely positioned to understand that pain of oppression in a way that is much deeper than most white people. but have a lot of similar access to power and money that other white communities have that give us the opportunity to fight for that change. So I think that is the heart of Jewish American political organizing. And next week we will look specifically at the Religious Action Center. And then our last week is coffee and just like whatever questions are left. I think sounds like maybe I don't there was, by doing the last one in person, maybe we don't need like a lesson, that we can just kind of talk about the topics. Okay, great. So we'll
Do
do
you
that
think
then.
the synagogue will be open by then, Beverly Hills, with all the trouble going on?
I think so. We had religious school today. It wasn't here. Wait, hold on. I'm gonna take. Oh, just gonna shut the record.